August 18, 1759. Dawn was breaking over the coast of Portugal, near Lagos Bay. Admiral Edward Boscawen stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Namur, his weathered hands gripping the brass telescope trained on 12 French ships seeking refuge in neutral Portuguese waters. Behind him, 14 British ships of the line waited in formation, their crews at quarters, cannons loaded, but held in check by the invisible barrier of international law. The situation was unprecedented in its legal clarity and strategic impossibility. International law was absolutely clear. Neutral waters meant inviolable sanctuary. Portuguese sovereignty extended 3 miles from shore, and any attack within those boundaries would constitute a war crime that could destroy Britain's alliance with Portugal and trigger a diplomatic crisis that might unite all Europe against British aggression. The political consequences could be catastrophic, but Boscawen knew exactly what those French ships represented for the invasion plan, gathering momentum across the Channel. These 12 ships of the line were meant to join other French squadrons to create the naval escort force required for the massive invasion army waiting in northern French ports. 100,000 soldiers crammed into invasion barges at Brest, Dunkirk and Le Havre could only cross the Channel if French warships controlled the narrow seas long enough to protect the vulnerable transports. If this fleet escaped to join other French squadrons, Britain would face the largest and most organised invasion attempt since Philip II's Spanish Armada had threatened Elizabeth's realm in 1588. The choice facing the British admiral was stark in its brutal simplicity. Respect the civilised conventions of international law and watch as the instruments of national destruction sailed away to safety, or break every rule of diplomatic warfare to eliminate a mortal threat to British survival. This is the story of Lagos, the battle where an English admiral chose national survival over international legality, the victory that prevented the invasion of 1759, and the day when breaking the rules saved Britain from conquest. The 7 Years' War had been raging for 3 years by 1759, and Britain was fighting for survival on multiple continents. In Europe, Frederick the Great battled French and Austrian armies, while British gold kept the Prussian war machine functioning. In North America, British forces were finally gaining the upper hand against French colonial armies. In India, the East India Company was consolidating its victories over French trading posts and local rulers, but all these distant victories meant nothing if France could land an army on English soil. Since 1756, the French government had been planning what they called la descente en Angleterre, the landing in England that would finally eliminate British power permanently and establish French hegemony over Europe. The plan was ambitious beyond anything attempted since William the Conqueror had crossed the Channel in 1066, and infinitely more complex. French armies totalling over 100,000 men would cross the English Channel in specially constructed invasion barges, while Spanish fleets would simultaneously attack British naval bases in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Ireland would rise in coordinated rebellion, while Scottish Jacobites would march south from the Highlands, dividing British military attention among multiple threats. The mastermind behind this grand strategy was Etienne François, Duc de Choiseul, Louis XIV's most capable minister, who understood that Britain's global empire depended entirely on naval supremacy and control of the home islands. Eliminate British naval power temporarily, land enough troops to capture London, and the entire imperial structure would collapse. British colonies in North America and India would be defenceless against renewed French expansion. The wealth that funded Britain's European alliances would disappear overnight. Frederick the Great would face Austrian and Russian armies alone. The balance of power that had emerged from the War of Austrian Succession would be permanently altered in France's favour. The key to this ambitious scheme was achieving naval superiority in the English Channel, even if only temporarily. French admirals didn't need to defeat the Royal Navy permanently in a decisive battle. They just needed to control the narrow seas long enough for invasion barges to ferry armies across 20 miles of water. Once French soldiers were ashore in Kent or Sussex, British forces would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior positioning. The capture of London would follow inevitably, and with it the collapse of British resistance. By early 1759, French preparations were nearly complete. Invasion barges filled every port from Dunkirk to Brest. The Army of England, commanded by the Duke of Aiguillon, numbered over 100,000 troops. Spanish support was secured through the Family Compact. Everything depended on getting enough French warships into the Channel to cover the invasion. This was where Admiral de Laclue entered the story. Jean-François de Laclue-Sabran commanded the French Mediterranean fleet, 12 ships of the line that represented France's best hope for naval supremacy in northern waters. His orders were simple: escape the Mediterranean, join French Atlantic squadrons, and create the naval force needed to cover the invasion. The British knew about these plans through intercepted dispatches and intelligence networks. They also knew that preventing de Laclue's escape was absolutely crucial. The task of preventing this catastrophe fell to Edward Boscawen, one of the Royal Navy's most experienced and ruthlessly effective commanders. At 57, Boscawen represented everything that made British naval leadership superior to its European rivals. He had spent 4 decades at sea, beginning as a 14-year-old midshipman and fighting his way through every major naval engagement since the War of Austrian Succession. His reputation was built on aggressive tactics, uncompromising personal courage, and an absolute commitment to victory, regardless of political or diplomatic cost. Sailors throughout the fleet called him Old Dreadnought for his willingness to take on impossible odds and his habit of positioning his flagship in the most dangerous part of any engagement. Officers respected his tactical brilliance and ability to make crucial decisions under extreme pressure. Politicians valued his results but worried about his methods, which often involved creative interpretations of orders and complete disregard for diplomatic niceties. Boscawen understood war as a professional matter where victory was the only acceptable outcome, regardless of the rules that peacetime diplomats preferred to follow. More importantly, Boscawen possessed the rare combination of strategic vision and tactical flexibility that distinguished great commanders from merely competent ones. He could see beyond immediate tactical situations to understand how individual engagements fit into broader strategic patterns. This perspective made him willing to take enormous risks when the strategic stakes justified potential losses. His career had demonstrated repeatedly that calculated aggression often achieved better results than cautious adherence to conventional wisdom. Boscawen's orders from the Admiralty were clear but diplomatically impossible: destroy de Laclue's fleet before it could reach the Atlantic. The problem was geography. The French Mediterranean fleet was based at Toulon, protected by coastal fortifications and positioned to break out when conditions were favourable. British patrols could watch for the French departure, but once de Laclue was at sea, catching him would require perfect timing and considerable luck. The strategic situation was complicated by Portugal's neutrality. King Joseph I had declared that Portuguese ports would welcome all belligerent fleets, but would not permit combat in Portuguese waters. This policy made sense for a weak nation trying to avoid being dragged into a major European war. Unfortunately for Britain, it also meant that French fleets could find sanctuary in Portuguese harbours whenever British squadrons threatened them. De Laclue's opportunity came in early August, when British attention was focused on supporting operations in North America and Germany. The French admiral slipped out of Toulon with 12 ships of the line and headed west through the Mediterranean. His plan was to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar at night, avoid British patrols and reach Brest before news of his escape spread through the Royal Navy's communication networks. Boscawen had positioned his fleet off Gibraltar specifically to intercept such an attempt. When lookouts reported French ships approaching the strait, the British admiral immediately gave chase, but de Laclue had timed his escape well. By the time British ships were in pursuit, the French fleet had a significant head start and was making good speed westward along the Portuguese coast. The chase that followed demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of 18th century naval warfare. British ships were generally faster and better handled than their French counterparts, but speed advantages were marginal when measured over hundreds of miles. De Laclue's fleet maintained its lead throughout August 17th, staying just beyond cannon range while British ships gradually closed the distance. Both admirals understood the stakes. If the French reached open Atlantic waters, they could disappear into the vastness of the ocean and eventually rendezvous with other French squadrons. If the British caught them before that happened, 12 French ships of the line would be eliminated from the invasion equation. The difference between success and failure might determine whether Britain survived as an independent nation. As night fell on August 17th, the chase entered Portuguese waters. De la Clue was heading for Lagos Bay, where Portuguese neutrality would provide sanctuary. Boscawen faced the crucial decision: respect international law and watch the French escape, or violate Portuguese sovereignty to engage the enemy fleet. Every principle of diplomatic conduct argued for restraint. Every instinct for national survival argued for attack. The legal issues were clear-cut. Portuguese neutrality had been recognised by all major European powers. Attacking enemy ships in Portuguese waters would violate the law of nations, potentially driving Portugal into the French camp and creating a diplomatic crisis that could destroy Britain's alliance system. The political consequences could be catastrophic, especially if the attack failed to eliminate all French ships and survivors escaped to spread word of British aggression. But Boscawen also understood the military reality. This was probably the only opportunity to intercept de la Clue's fleet before it reached French Atlantic ports. Once these ships joined other French squadrons, the invasion of Britain would become inevitable. Faced with a choice between diplomatic propriety and national survival, there was really no choice at all. At dawn on August 18th, Boscawen's decision became action. British ships entered Lagos Bay with guns run out and battle flags flying. The message was unmistakable. Neutrality be damned. This was British determination to survive regardless of diplomatic consequences. Portuguese authorities protested vigorously, but their coastal batteries were too weak to challenge British ships of the line. De la Clue attempted to form a battle line as British ships entered the bay, but his vessels were caught at anchor and completely unprepared for immediate action. The French admiral faced an impossible tactical situation. His ships were trapped against the Portuguese coast, with insufficient room to manoeuvre, while British vessels approached in perfect formation, with the weather gauge and initiative. Some French vessels managed to get underway, frantically weighing anchor and attempting to gain sea room, but others remained helplessly exposed to British gunfire. The engagement that followed was less a formal naval battle than a systematic destruction of ships unable to defend themselves effectively. HMS Namur, Boscawen's flagship, engaged the French flagship Ocean in a brutal, point-blank duel that demonstrated why the British admiral had earned his fearsome reputation. Boscawen deliberately positioned his ship directly alongside the enemy flagship, choosing to trade devastating broadsides at murderously close range rather than engage at the safer distances preferred by more cautious commanders. The destruction was appalling and immediate. Both ships suffered enormous casualties as 64-pound cannons fired into hulls and rigging from ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Ocean's mainmast crashed down within minutes. Her quarterdeck was swept by British grapeshot, and her gun crews were decimated by the concentrated fire of Namur's experienced gunners. Yet the French flagship continued fighting with desperate courage, her remaining guns returning fire even as her hull filled with water and her decks ran red with blood. Other British ships systematically engaged the remaining French vessels, each captain following Boscawen's aggressive example. HMS Newark destroyed 2 French 74s within an hour. HMS Intrepid forced a French 60-gun ship ashore where she became a total loss. The precision and coordination of the British attack revealed years of training and experience that French crews simply could not match. The decisive moment came when French resistance began to collapse under the overwhelming firepower and superior seamanship of Boscawen's squadron. 2 French ships attempted to escape by deliberately running ashore on Portuguese beaches, their captains preferring internment by neutral authorities to destruction by British guns. Others struck their colours after sustaining damage that made continued resistance not just hopeless, but suicidal. The French fleet that had entered Lagos Bay as a coherent fighting force was reduced to burning wrecks and captured prizes within 4 hours of intense combat. By sunset on August 18th, only 5 French ships remained capable of any further action, and those were in no condition to continue toward their Atlantic rendezvous with other French squadrons. De la Cluse's Mediterranean fleet had ceased to exist as an effective naval force. The French invasion plan had lost its crucial naval component, and with it any realistic hope of landing armies on English soil. Boscawen's victory was complete but diplomatically disastrous. Portuguese authorities immediately lodged formal protests with every major European capital, denouncing the violation of their sovereignty and demanding British withdrawal from Lagos Bay. The French government, despite their military defeat, gained enormous propaganda value from British disregard for international law. French diplomats denounced British aggression throughout European courts and demanded international intervention against what they characterised as piracy disguised as naval warfare. Even British allies expressed serious concern about the precedent of ignoring neutral rights when convenient. Yet the strategic results were exactly what Boscawen had intended and what British survival required. De la Cluse's Mediterranean fleet no longer existed as an effective fighting force capable of supporting invasion plans. The French naval strategy depended on combining squadrons from different ports to achieve temporary superiority in the English Channel. With 12 ships of the line eliminated at Lagos, that mathematical equation became impossible. The French invasion plan lost its essential naval component and began to collapse within weeks of the Lagos engagement. By September 1759, French invasion preparations that had consumed enormous resources and planning for 3 years were being abandoned as militarily hopeless. The Army of England was dispersed to other theatres, invasion barges were converted back to normal shipping, and French strategic attention shifted to defending existing positions rather than attempting conquests. The immediate existential threat to British survival had been eliminated through one admiral's willingness to break international law, when national destruction was the alternative. The broader consequences of Lagos extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. The battle demonstrated that Britain would violate any principle, including diplomatic agreements with allies to ensure national survival. This sent a powerful message to enemies and allies alike. British determination was unlimited when core interests were threatened. Domestically, the victory was celebrated despite its questionable legality. British public opinion cared nothing for Portuguese neutrality when national survival was at stake. Boscawen became a popular hero, and his willingness to break rules for victory was seen as exactly the kind of leadership Britain needed during its darkest hour. The Portuguese government eventually accepted British explanations and compensation for the neutrality violation. King Joseph understood that antagonising Britain permanently would be more dangerous than accepting a single incident of British aggression. Within months, normal relations were restored, proving that successful violation of international law could be forgiven if the strategic results were significant enough. For the Royal Navy, Lagos validated aggressive tactics and decisive leadership. The battle became a case study in how professional military leaders should respond when legal restrictions conflict with strategic necessities. Sometimes breaking the rules was the highest form of duty, and Boscawen's example would inspire future commanders to prioritise victory over diplomatic constraints when national interests were threatened. The timing of Lagos within the broader context of 1759 was crucial. The victory came just months before British triumphs at Minden and Quebec, completing what historians would call the annus mirabilis of British arms. Each victory reinforced the others, creating momentum that carried Britain to ultimate success in the 7 Years' War. Lagos was the foundation that made subsequent victories possible. The battle also highlighted the importance of individual leadership in determining historical outcomes. Boscawen's decision to attack in Portuguese waters was taken by one man in a moment of crisis. A more cautious admiral might have respected neutral rights and allowed the French fleet to escape. The entire course of the 7 Years' War might have been different without that single decision to ignore diplomatic constraints when national survival was at stake. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the battles where individual courage changed the course of nations, the moments when commanders chose victory over legality. The decisions that determined whether Britain would survive or fall. Then you know what to do. These are the stories that demonstrate how the British Empire was built by men willing to take ultimate responsibility for ultimate decisions. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles that built an empire, told the way they deserve to be told.